I am so proud of myself with this project. You may not understand where that pride comes from, but you may be a hater, so. The primary reason I'm so excited about it is that I draped the whole thing from start to finish. I've draped like sections of pieces before and kind of like problem solved or troubleshot things through draping, but primarily I've been drafting all my patterns. Drafting is when you're drawing on paper exactly how you're going to cut the fabric before you cut it. Draping, by contrast, is when you're taking fabric and pinning it to a dress form and making design decisions, designing what you're going to cut right on the dress form. The obvious advantage to draping is that you can see how gravity and your fabric interact with the design elements. So you can make decisions about like how much gathering you want based on what it looks like versus kind of guessing how much gathering you want on paper and then pulling it together and adjusting. There's still guessing and kind of trial and error, but I found I was able to have a lot more control over the design. When I'm drafting, I'm sometimes taking shortcuts to account for the fact that I don't know exactly how it's going to work out. Coming out of it, I'm feeling really inspired to do more draping. I had it in my head that like it's impossible without a proper dress form. And don't get me wrong, I very much will be getting a proper dress form at some point once I can stomach the cost. But it worked out okay with my adjustable, pretty inexpensive, not so great one. Ultimately, I made a piece that I think looks really professional and does not scream homemade, at least not to me. Maybe to some other more seasoned or more perfectionist sewists.
My original design was big billowy sleeves with a pretty standard connection to a blouse that had gathers on both the front and the back and a slit a few inches down from the neckline with cuffs around the wrists. I eyeballed some armholes and a neck hole and made gathers along the shoulders. I immediately knew this was not quite right. So much gathering in one place was just too heavy for such a lightweight fabric. So I started pinning some fabric to my dress form, creating gathers along the neckline. I played around with it until it felt like it was falling nicely and decided I wanted to go with a raglan sleeve instead. I then marked and cut where a sleeve and side seam naturally fit. I then pressed my draping fabric nice and flat and compared the width to a shirt that is made of similar fabric as what I'll be sewing with and has kind of the flowiness that I'm going for. I used the fabric I draped with as a pattern and cut out approximate pattern pieces in my actual fabric. To sew gathers along the neckline, I used the longest stitch on my machine to sew 3 parallel lines all the way along the neckline. I then gently pulled those threads and let the fabric gather up. I pinned the front pattern piece to my dress form along the neckline. I then found a large rectangle and pinned that to the back to begin envisioning how the front and back will connect. I marked center back because it's always a good idea to mark center back. Then I started marking where the front and back would connect and where a back armhole might be. I checked the measurement of my neck around the neck I'm working with to make sure it would fit well. I accounted for seam allowance and trimmed along my cut lines. Back in my dress form, I started working out what the sleeve will look like. I laid a piece of fabric on top of my attached front and back pieces and started marking where the front and the back meet the potential sleeve. At this point, I wasn't feeling confident with my sleeve shape, so I took an existing sleeve that I know fits me well and put that down for comparison. I then kind of extended it up the way a raglan sleeve would. I trimmed the excess fabric from my sleeve and sewed the underarm together. Next, I used a ton of pins to attach my sleeve to my front and back pieces, put it on my dress form, and started evaluating the fit. I immediately knew that how the front and the sleeve came together wasn't quite right, so I started repinning that, taking out some extra fabric in the front. This was maybe my favorite part of the whole process. It was really easy to make these kind of adjustments, pulling out that extra material in the front and using the pins to determine a new sew line. After this first round of revisions, I sewed everything together with a large basting stitch and then put the garment on.
This is just not right, clearly. We want this to lie much more smoothly and just have these folds going all down, not this kind of fold coming up. I also think that there's just too much ease at the bust and down. I'm going to take that in. See how the back is just kind of all lying nice? That's what the front should do. And I think to do that, we really have to make this come back out more like this.
With that information, I cut a new sleeve and repeated the process I had before on the dress form, adjusting how the front and the sleeve connect and marking new sew lines. At this point, I also decided I wanted more ease in my sleeve. I split the sleeve from the shoulder down and then added a triangle of fabric to add in that ease. I tried it on again and was much happier with the fit all around. I used this sleeve as a pattern and then cut out 2 of them in my actual fabric. I sewed that all together and then got to work on my neckline. I removed the basting stitches that created the gathers along the neckline and then re-sewed them, only this time going from center front to each shoulder so that I could create a split down the middle. To determine the shape of the collar, I took a scrap piece of fabric and laid it on my dress form underneath the shirt so that it reached from center front to center back. I then simply traced the curve of the neckline onto the scrap fabric. I marked 3/8 of an inch below that line to indicate the desired seam line between my shirt and my collar. Then I marked up from that the desired height of my collar and added seam allowances. I cut this out and brought it back to my dress form. I laid it in place and decided that there was essentially an extra triangle of fabric that I wanted to remove. I just folded that away and then traced a new curve and created a new pattern piece. I tested this new pattern piece and was much happier with it, so I cut it out in my actual fabric. The actual construction of this piece, but this neckline in particular, was a whole challenge in and of itself because of how shifty the fabric is, so I'm going to do a whole separate video focused on how I did my seams, hems, finished the collar without ripping out my hair.